ceasefire in which Hamas was supposed to stop all rocket fire and Israel was supposed to open all those border crossings leading into Gaza. But Hamas kept firing 1 or 2 and sometimes 3 rockets a week, which was just enough to terrorize all of southern Israel. Imagine if only 1 or 2 rockets were falling in the greater Washington area per week. Could you carry on your lives? Could you send your kids to school? You couldn't. And Israel felt it had no choice but to close the border crossings in response. Finally, on November 5th, Israeli commandos attacked a tunnel that was being dug under the Gaza border, apparently another attempt to kidnap Israeli soldiers, and 6 Hamas gunmen were killed in the exchange. Dozens of rockets now rained onto Israel, and the question arose whether the ceasefire, set to expire on December 19th, would be renewed. Israeli Foreign Minister Tzipi Livni hurried to Cairo. She made a public and impassioned request to Hamas to cease firing rockets, to renew the ceasefire. Prime Minister Oren made a similar appeal on Al Arabiya television. But Hamas was divided. It was divided between Hamas inside Gaza under Prime Minister Ismail Haniyeh and Hamas outside of Gaza, headquartered in Damascus under the leadership of Khaled Mashal, a close ally of Iran, which did not want to renew the ceasefire. Mashal in Iran won the argument. For 3 days after December 19th, close to 300 rockets and mortar shells fell on Israel. Now, commentators would later speculate whether Livni and Defense Minister Ehud Barak would act out of electoral considerations. There was an Israeli election pending. It's coming up in February. Or whether they wanted to take advantage of the fact that George Bush was still in the White House and Barack Obama had yet to enter. There may, who knows, be some truth in that. We'll have to wait for the 30-year rule, 30 years now, and the documents are declassified. But the fact of the matter remained that the Israeli state, which is constituted to defend the Jewish people, could no longer countenance an assault on its population. The IDF now signaled its readiness. More than 90% of the Israelis said they were behind the operation. And as in previous Arab-Israeli wars in 1948, 1956, 67, 82, 2002, the pattern just repeats itself. The Arabs had provoked Israel 1 too many times and literally drove Israel's citizens' armies to arms. Hamas would now experience what Dwight Eisenhower called the fury of an aroused democracy. And that fury burst out on December 27th. Operation Cast Lead, that was its code name. It was a reference to a Hanukkah poem written by Chaim Nachman Bialik. The operation took place during Hanukkah. It started with a stunning aerial attack. 80 aircraft hit 100 targets in less than 4 minutes. Convinced that Israel would never attack, Hamas gunmen, policemen were all out in parade that day. 200 of them were killed within those first 4 minutes. The airstrikes continued for another 6 days. The IDF, all told, would fly about 2,000 sorties. It would eliminate dozens of Hamas command posts, arms caches, rocket launchers, and 300 of the estimated 500 tunnels running under that Philadelphia route. This time, there was no distinguishing between Hamas military and political targets. The homes of Hamas leaders, mosques used as arms depots, even the Islamic University, which Israel claimed was being used as a bomb laboratory, all of them were destroyed. Sacrificing the element of surprise, Israeli planes leafleted areas that were targeted for strikes. They warned the population to flee. Text messages were sent to thousands of phone owners, also warning them of impending attacks. Hamas sent civilians up on the roofs of targeted buildings, compelling Israeli pilots to divert missiles even after they had been fired. Ultimately, the Israeli Air Force would use a form of non-lethal flash weapon to clear the roof of civilians before an actual weapon was fired. Senior Hamas officials were killed, among them Nazir Rayyan, the third in command in Hamas, who actually refused to let his family and his children leave the building after they were warned to do so. 2 of his 4 wives, 7 of his children were killed in that attack. But the aerial attack did not stop Hamas rockets. An average of 70 rockets fell each day during the first week of the operation. All told, about 800 would hit Israel. But the ranges were longer than previously known, not 15 kilometers, not 20, but up to 40 kilometers, bringing nearly 1 million Israelis within rocket range, one of them being our daughter Leah, a student at Ben Gurion University in Beersheba, who called us one day to tell us that she had to leave our car at an intersection in Beersheba because the siren went off, and she had to run off looking for a bomb shelter and couldn't find one, and had to go banging on various doors asking people to let her in, because in Beersheba you have only 1 minute from the time that siren goes off to the time the rocket hits. Nice old lady let Leah in, gave her lunch, wanted her to stay, but she had to go out and get the car out of the intersection. Learning its lessons from the Lebanon War, Israel did not declare its goal this time to be the suspension of all rocket fire, the destruction of Hamas, or even the release of Gilad Shalit. Rather, the objections were kept broad: impair Hamas's ability to shell Israel, restore security to southern Israel, and alter the security situation in Gaza. Also, from Lebanon, Israel learned that warplanes alone cannot eliminate rocket fire, and a ground incursion was mounted. January 3rd, 10,000 Israeli armored and infantry soldiers advanced into Gaza. Some 10,000 reservists were called up. I was one of them. I'd gone home for a quick vacation during my break from Georgetown, my winter break. I got my order on my telephone. That's Israel 2009. They used to come and knock on your door once upon a time. Now you get your telephone ringing telling you've been called up. 8 hours later, I was in uniform again. The response to the Israeli reserve call-up was 100%. Ponder that, 100%. Israeli forces divided the Strip into 3 parts, hampering Hamas's ability to transport men and munitions from place to place. Israeli commandos landed on the sea. All of them began to press inward, driving Hamas fighters into urban areas. Hamas gunmen, for the most part, did not fight. They ran. They fled underground. Hamas leaders were reputed to be hiding under Shifa Hospital in Gaza. They left the civilian population to take the brunt of the Israeli advance, essentially using them as shields. The IDF took precautions to limit civilian casualties, but here too it had learned some lessons, not from Lebanon, but from the fighting in 2002, particularly in Jenin. In Jenin, in one afternoon, 23 reservists were killed going house to house to ferret out gunmen, and the IDF had concluded that such losses were devastating to the army and national morale, and they resolved to change the order of fire. Now, if there was fire coming out of a building, that building was going to be destroyed. Israeli soldiers weren't going to go in there first. And if Hamas was using ambulances to transport fighters, and Hamas did use ambulances to transport fighters, then Israeli soldiers were very loath to let ambulances pass through their perimeters, a practice that was vociferously condemned by the International Red Cross. With that, the IDF also took extraordinary measures to try to relieve any humanitarian crisis in Gaza, opening the border crossings to some 27,000 tons of food and medical supplies, 240 tons of fuel during the crisis. Later in a campaign, a corridor was opened for relief trucks, and a 3-hour daily truce was proclaimed so that civilians on Gaza could stock up on supplies. Hamas, you should know, regularly violated that truce with rocket fire. Its gunmen seized flour shipments off of relief trucks, sold them for profit. My unit actually uncovered one of those trucks that was shipping in not food, it was labeled food, but under the tarpaulin was Hamas military uniforms for the winter. Nevertheless, civilian casualties, along with the damaging of civilian and especially UN buildings, swiftly became an international focus. Now, the IDF kept a fairly fastidious list of casualties in the Gaza Strip. It concluded that there were no more than 25% civilian casualties. The UN sources claimed that there were 40% civilian casualties. Hamas health sources, those are the Hamas health sources that were housed in Shifa Hospital over the Hamas leadership, claimed that there were 50% civilian casualties. More recently, in the last couple of days, an Italian doctor working in Shifa Hospital claimed that the civilian casualties were actually less than 25%. Now, all civilian casualties are tragic. They are regrettable. But even the Hamas claim of 50% civilian casualties compares favorably with the civilian to soldier casualty rate of NATO